Well, food and holiday food trends is the topic on this edition of MSU Today, and it's great to welcome three MSU-related foodies to the program to discuss it. We have Helen White with us, who's an associate professor of history, and Cheryl Kirschenbaum hosts Serving Up Science on PBS, which is produced right here at WKAR by Brant Wells and his team. And Chef Kurt Kwiatkowski is back. Spartan Nation probably remembers Kurt, who was so involved in the change of this dorm food and the food at Spartan Stadium. Recently retired to take on a better position, not a better position, a different position at Gordon Food Service. So great to have you all here. So I introduced you, but Helen, you first, a little bit about your interest in food, where you come at this conversation from.
Sure. I am an associate professor of American history in the MSU History Department, and my specialty is food. So I work on food in American history, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. So pretty modern. In fact, I'm interested in the modernization of food, how we got to eat the way we do. One thing I always tell my students is that the way we eat today is very strange. Most people in history ate extremely differently than we do. And what's so interesting about that is that most of us tend to assume that the way we eat is normal because our tastes and our preferences and what we find disgusting, that feels very intuitive to most of us. And coming to realize that most of it is actually learned is pretty fascinating. It opens up a lot of different questions.
And Chef Kurt, tell me how you got interested in cooking and food and sort of where you come at it today.
Oh, wow. Where does it start? I think, that first food memory is being on a step stool with my grandmother and having that smell of chicken noodle soup kind of wafting in the air and trying to understand how does something so delicious come out of this one pot and just be so involved with it. And then on my dad's side of the family meat, every time we were there, my grandmother was in the kitchen and making food and these smells, and some of them good and some of them bad, or just maybe not bad, just like abrasive. Because I remember walking into the back of my grandmother's, like the back door into the kitchen, and they were grinding horseradish. And it was almost like tear gas. And as a kid, it was like, but I still have that food memory. And today I love horseradish. So I have this thing that I feel that food brings people together. And I love how we can have discussions about it and we break bread and how it just brings people together is something that's always just sat really close to my heart.
Very applicable to the holiday season too. And Cheryl, how did you get involved with Serving Up Science? Tell us a little bit about the program and some things you've learned.
Absolutely. And it's such a treat to be here with a group of foodies. So my career has centered on the relationships between science and society. So how do we connect with each other and what can we learn about ourselves and our world through essentially science and culture? But what better topic for that than centering it all around food, because food is, as Chef Kurt was just saying, it brings families and communities together. It shapes us on a personal level. It impacts our environment. It impacts our future. And so that is a great way to tell stories about, who we are as individuals and as a culture and as a global society. So at Michigan State University, I work on Serving Up Science, and the idea is to cultivate a culture where more of us understand where our food comes from and how it impacts our world.
Helen, how about a little bit on traditions and holiday food traditions over the years, how they've developed, where they're going, do you think?
Yeah, so as we get into the holiday season, a lot of us are thinking about food more and more, which is a good thing, I think. Americans used to eat together a lot more than we do today. And there were cultural reasons for that, but there were also logistical reasons. One of the big reasons was that in previous decades, and especially previous centuries, there wasn't a lot of preserved food. If you were going to consume food, it was food that had been recently cooked. And the time to eat it together was when it was recently cooked, and people would gather at that moment. So there was this kind of technological, infrastructural mechanism that just got people together at meals. Now, when food is ready to eat, off the shelves, microwavable, instantly edible, you can eat it in your car, you can go through a fast food drive-through. There's really no longer a logistical or a technological reason to eat together. And I think that's significant. I think something more than digestion happens when people gather together to share food. The sort of conviviality, the happiness, there's something deeply social, I think deeply human about what goes on. I mean, cooking is something uniquely human. It's hard to point to anything else more uniquely human than cooking. Even language, even tool making. Some animals do those things, but animals don't really cook. That's a human thing, eating together. And holidays are a time when we do that. And a lot of us cherish holiday meals for that reason. It's a time when the family comes together. People also have a lot of stress around the holidays because putting together these big feasts is labor intensive. It takes a lot of work. It takes planning. Of course, sometimes it's fun, but it's almost always stressful for the people doing it. But, I don't know that I see that changing. I don't know that I see holiday family meals going away anytime soon. I think that they're so important to so many people. And they feed something in us that's more than physical.
And how did something like turkey become associated with Thanksgiving, for example?
Yeah, well, there's good reason to think that at the first Thanksgiving in the 1620s in what's now Massachusetts, people probably did consume turkey. It's a bird that's native to North America. They also consumed other things that we do not generally associate with Thanksgiving, like eels, venison. Some people might have venison, but it's probably not that common. Different kinds of fish. The other traditional Thanksgiving foods like cranberry and pumpkin, those are also native North American ingredients. So that's something that's been, at least symbolically really consistent, this idea of we're eating something that's indigenous to the Americas.
And they ate it because it was there and they could get it, I guess.
Exactly, yeah.
And Chef Kurt, when we talked about a decade ago, like I said, said we were trending towards more side dishes and a lot of different dishes, not so much one big bird. Are we continuing, and what are the trends today?
I think there's a bit of an evolution in that, right? And I still believe that sides are where it's at, and it isn't necessarily just going to be turkey. We had the bad avian flu that really struck the turkey population hard for a couple of years, and so people had to move away from that because you didn't want to spend $70, $80, $100 for a turkey. And maybe it wasn't that extreme, but it was a lot more than what you would normally spend. So people looked to other proteins that they could cook for a large group and everybody could enjoy. And ham's usually one of those that's an easy one, or a beef roast of sorts. But I think one of the things you're starting to see is vegetables becoming part of the sides, multiple vegetables, instead of just it being green bean casserole or like sweet potatoes that have a pile of maple syrup on it. We're looking at different ways to introduce those vegetables. Maybe it's a fondant sweet potato that's then got a compound butter on top of it. And I also see a lot of world flavors being brought into things. So it isn't just your traditional thyme, sage, butter kind of profile. Now you're bringing in chili crunch, and you're bringing in maybe gochujang or sriracha or vadavan or some curry or garam masala, and because you can throw a little accent of those flavors into a vegetable, and it can just bring it, like elevate it to a whole nother level.
And Cheryl, I'm wondering, why do you think it's important that we know more about where our food comes from?
I'm thinking right now that I'd like to have Thanksgiving at Chef Kurt's house after that last bit. So what we see in surveys that we've done at Michigan State, where we've done nationally representative polls on what people understand about the food system, what we see over and over is the answer is very little. So we see that usually more than half of Americans say they rarely or never think about where their food comes from or how it impacts their environment or their health. Now, the thing is, these agricultural practices that provide us with these grand masala turkey dishes that we just heard about, they sustain our world. And the food system is becoming more strained because of factors like climate change, because we don't always have the resources that we've had in the past to produce the amount of food in the places that we traditionally have. And so as more of us understand about our food, what's going on with our food system, more of us understand the processes involved, not just the techniques, but how water and energy and all of these other resources combine to create the bounty of the food that we enjoy and we've come to expect will land on our plate, we can appreciate how we need to change our own path, whether that's through more efficient means of producing energy, more efficient means of moving water. All of these different parts of the climate story and the food story really are interwoven together in ways that we usually don't see. So all this to say, I think it's really important that more of us think about where our food comes from, because ultimately we'll be able to live a lot more sustainably and comfortably when we get a little bit more knowledgeable about what we eat.
And there's at least some question, right? Can we feed the 10 billion people that are expected to be on the planet in the mid-century?
And the truth is we can. So it's often, people often say, oh, we're not going to have enough food. There's more and more and more people. But it has a lot to do with how we use resources and what we do on a per capita basis. And so even just thinking about the way we consume energy, the average American per capita consumes twice as much energy as the average person living in Europe, who consumes twice as much energy as the average person living in China. So we're not all having the same impact. And what we know is, or at least what scientists are telling us, is that we can be a lot more efficient and a lot less wasteful and make sure there's more of what we have to go around.
And expound on that. One of the huge issues that we've talked about before is the waste. I think it's upwards to 30 or 40%.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, Russ, because as you know, I could talk about food waste for hours. So the thing is, at a time when we should be as careful as we possibly can be with our food system, with our natural resources, we are throwing away between 1/3 and 1/2 of the food that we produce. And that's wild. When you consider all of the water we're wasting, all the energy we're wasting, all of the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gases we're producing in the process to produce food that ultimately gets tossed. And along the way, you're also refrigerating the food, storing the food, harvesting the food. You're putting all of this energy and effort into creating stuff that nobody ever eats. So at a point at which we're all thinking we have to innovate and create new technologies to combat climate change, well, food waste is sitting right in front of us, literally. And there's so much we can do now to make sure what we have goes even further, and also at the same time serves to feed food insecure communities, right? Like if we're a little bit better about not wasting as much through our buffet culture. Like buffets are a little bit odd. No offense if you love buffets, Chef Kurt.
No.
But we have these practices that we've come to think are normal. And just as Helen was saying, there's a lot we do with food right now in 2023 that isn't traditionally part of how people have had relationships with food before. So we can distribute it better, we can waste less, and we can do a lot more for ourselves and the planet.
And to kind of jump in a little bit on that, and one of the things that I think, unfortunately, sometimes people, they like have this association with food, like, oh, I went out to this restaurant, it was really, really good. I'm like, oh, well, what was great about it? Oh, the portion was huge. And it's like they don't even eat the whole thing. And maybe it gets wasted, maybe it doesn't. But somehow that association of this large portion we need to move past that and maybe just focus on having several bites that are just absolutely amazing. And I think if we look at also like actual ingredients, the satiation, like how you feel full, right? When you eat more natural ingredients and when you put those items into your body, instead of something that's highly, highly processed, you can feel a lot fuller with less.
Mm-hmm.
It's even possible to waste food by eating it when you don't need it. I mean, I worked in a bakery in high school, and there was a lot of food being thrown out, and I would think to myself, oh, I can't let this go to waste. Let me eat it. And day after day, I'd be eating, in this really kind of, teenage righteous attempt to prevent food waste. And I realized after a couple of weeks, I was wasting it in a sense. I didn't need all this food that I was eating. I was trying to eat more and more. And, these big portions, even if someone finishes a huge portion, that's not necessarily not going to waste if they didn't need it. And I'm not saying that people should get by on a survival ration or anything like that, but Americans, on average eat much more than we need. And that's something else that, would benefit not just the environment, but also our bodies.
Absolutely. And I'll just add to that, because there's that component, but also what you talked about, working in a bakery, seeing all the food that's going to waste. When we think about expiration dates, or more often, quote, sell-by dates or even use-by dates, those are not, for the most part, a scientifically rigorous process that determines when our food spoils. So we are tossing so many perfectly fine ingredients, perfectly fine staples that we depend on just because they're past pretty arbitrary date. Food safety is extremely important, and we can talk about that too.
Yeah.
But for a lot of these products that have a random date, a seemingly random date stamped on them, that's not necessarily an indication that that product has gone bad. And when you look at how that scales up to the restaurant community, to the grocery store community, they are tossing all sorts, like literally tons of food that is perfectly fine to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And Kurt, Cheryl led us beautifully into food safety.
Yeah.
I got a feeling this time of year there's probably people maybe helping in the kitchen that don't, maybe other times, but it can't hurt to remind first some, like when you're preparing and keeping things safe, what are some tips?
Yeah, wash your hands.
Yeah.
Wash your hands, sanitize the area, right? Think about raw ingredients. If you're going to do some vegetable prep, I always say get the vegetable prep done ahead. Or if you're going to prep the bird and do what you got to do with the bird or whatever raw proteins you're using, do that, get that in the oven, get it started, whether it's going on your grill or your smoker, or if you're going to deep fry it, be careful. But whatever that is, then take not even 2 minutes and get some disinfectant out and wipe down everything, not just where the bird was. Get rid of that cutting board, wash it down, disinfect it, sanitize it, clean it, and then just restart. It takes 2-3 minutes, and it's going to keep everybody safe, for lack of it. Yeah, it's just, you just don't want to risk it. You just don't.
Yeah, and Cheryl talked about buffets. The other thing is, this stuff can't sit out, and you can graze for not very long, as long as people think, right?
Yeah, I try to not keep things out. And then when you're going to put stuff away, make sure you're putting it away the right way, too. So if you can keep it hot, have your meal, and then we want to cool it down as fast as we possibly can. And whether that, pending weather, we're in Michigan, it could be 20 degrees or it could be 50. We don't know. It's nice when it's 20 because we have an outdoor refrigerator. But you want to get that food, so get it in as thin a layer as possible. Or if it's a soup, get it into a bigger container so the surface area is greater, instead of in a really small container where it's filled all the way up, because it's going to take longer for that soup to cool down. And then don't lid it right away. Anything that's hot, make sure it's vented, because what can happen is that moisture can build up inside that bag or inside that container, and you have the potential for a foodborne illness.
And haven't you said before, though, don't put stuff really hot right in. Let it cool down somewhat. Don't just put something blazing hot in the fridge right away.
Right. Yeah, please because then it's going to raise the temperature in the fridge that much more too. So, it's kind of like a staged thing. Like, get everything. All right, everybody's done eating. We got our 2.5 hours of grazing. We're done. Into bags or containers. It sits out. It's probably room temp by that point anyway. Then it can go into the fridge.
And people love their leftovers at the holiday season.
Please,
what are some? How long can we keep stuff?
After it's been cooked, my rule of thumb is trying no more than 4 days. It's probably 3-4 days. It doesn't last longer than that in my house, but in others. And if you're not sure, hedge on the side of, I made this huge batch of stuffing and now I got some left over. You can get a Ziploc bag. I mean, food savers are cheap nowadays. Put it in a food saver, vacuum seal it, throw it in the freezer, label it, date it, and then when you want some stuffing, another week or two later, pull it out, thaw it, and eat it up. And you're going to be a lot safer that way.
How long in the freezer, though? Even there's a limit.
Again, yeah. I mean, a couple of months. And the vacuum sealers actually do a much better job because, again, you don't have air gaps, or a lot less of an air gap, and so you don't have the ability for what would be called freezer burn, or you get that protein starting to deteriorate literally in the freezer because at that cold temperature, the protein structure just starts to break down.
And Helen, you were talking about how our eating has evolved, and I think your latest project is about how picky kids are eating. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, my next book is a history of children's picky eating, and what's so interesting.
Cheryl's perked up ears.
And of course, today picky eaters are absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
But what is so fascinating is that they weren't in the past. If you go back to the 19th century, Americans talked about children being childish eaters. And what they meant by that in the 19th century was that children were so greedy and so curious and so indiscriminating. Unlike adults, they saw adults as being pickier, as being more refined, having the maturity to make choices and to make distinctions between different foods. Children in the 19th century, by all accounts, ate happily and curiously. You know, that has to do with a lot of different factors, the evolution of pickier children today. And one of the fascinating things is that we see it spreading globally. Since, you know, even in the 1960s, anthropologists reported from around the world on children happily eating what adults were eating, whether it was, meat from animals that we wouldn't think of to eat ourselves, or a huge variety of vegetables or grains, or even spicy things or fermented things. But now we see childhood pickiness rising around the world. We also see childhood obesity rising around the world. These things are not the same, but I think they both have to do with the industrialization of our food supply, the instant availability of hyper-palatable food that trains children and also trains adults to really want these, super sweet, salty, savory, fatty, delicious foods that aren't really what it's going to be good for us in the long run.
And, we were all talking about sustainability before we were recording. Just your thoughts on sustainability and food and how they relate together.
I guess for me, one of the things that I've been seeing is, we can call it, the buzzword for a long time was farm to table. But I think what the chefs are trying to do is just use local ingredients. And then when it's not in season, figure out a way. Many, many years ago, we had fermentation, we had the drying process, we had a way to preserve products. So you might not be able to get a fresh fig all year round or a fresh apricot all year round, but you can do things to those when you harvest them. We're going to have fresh apricots. So, when we look at Michigan, let's say, we're going to have cherries on the menu here, 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 and here. Doesn't mean you can't have cherries on all year round, but you're just not going to have them in a fresh mode. You can freeze them. You can dehydrate them. You can preserve them. You can dry them. There are so many other ways. So then your menu can flex to the seasons and look at seasonality. When peaches are in season and tomatoes might not be in season, put a peach in there instead of a tomato, because surprisingly it actually works. In looking at that from a local standpoint.
And Cheryl, sustainability and food, what comes to mind?
Oh, my brain is going a million different directions with what Chef Kurt just said, but I like that Chef Kurt just brought up that local is good, but local doesn't always necessarily mean more sustainable. So it has to do with time of year, season, then latitude, all these other factors.
The way you cook it yourself. I mean, you can get local carrots, but if you blast a couple of local carrots in a 400-degree oven, that's not necessarily more sustainable than the carrots that arrived on a big steamer with tons of other carrots that you have raw. I mean, it's actually quite complicated.
And when you look at the emissions from all the different aspects of our food system, the transportation piece is a lot smaller than many of us consider. What's huge is land use changes. So if you're clearing a whole old growth forest for some use, then you're losing all sorts of what you had there that was like a great place where you could do, where you could be capturing carbon. And something that I've been spending a little more time thinking about lately, which I think touches on all of this, is soil structure. When we think about food, we don't often think about soil very much. But if the soil on a farm has been tilled and treated with all sorts of chemicals, it no longer has the structure to hold water, to support a root system, to keep that space very, very fertile, and ultimately also to trap carbon and to do all these great things. But farmers know that there's different ways we can treat our soil. So when we're thinking about kind of the start of where we're going to grow and fertilize and harvest our food, we can start from the soil, where we lose a ton of what we need to produce the food that we depend on.
Yeah, it makes me think about, I got a chance to visit some, I got to go to Saskatchewan and visit some lentil farmers and talk about what is and about the soil erosion that can happen if you're not careful in how you're rotating crops. And to hear, I got a chance just recently in September to visit the Salinas Valley, which is kind of like the salad bowl capital of the world. but looking at crop rotation so that the amount of soil depth and the nutrient dense soil is kept at the deepest level possible, obviously, but you can't plant the exact same crop year after year after year and expect things to work out correctly. You have to, some are going to pull more nutrients out, some are going to put other in, and you just have that crop rotation so that you can keep the quality of that soil as high as possible.
And Helen, does sustainability figure into your research at all?
Yeah, well, it figures more into my teaching. I teach
Okay.
a lot about sustainability and modern food systems, and I think food is absolutely at the center of what we're all going to have to figure out moving further into this century. I think it's not the only thing that's important to think about, but boy, it's one of the most important things.
And then building on something that Helen started with, you were talking about food as a kind of universal language, and we've all been describing food as something that brings us together. An area that we haven't touched on, but I feel like is perfect with the holidays coming up, is something I've been a little more focused on called food diplomacy, and there's lots of ways into that. But because food brings people together, there are all sorts of efforts that I've been working with and I've been learning about around the world, bringing different refugees together to share and cook and literally break bread together. And I think it's more than just kind of goodwill or wishful thinking. When we start to understand each other and we sit together, we have a meal around a table, it's a chance to connect on such an important human level that it gives me hope that, maybe we can solve some of these great big conflicts we're thinking about.
Yeah.
Right now.
I mean, the bad news, that we saw in the 20th century is that when you have these, environmentally degrading farming practices that are linked to, huge and wasteful transportation structures that are linked to the industrialization of diets that are linked to really poor health outcomes and bad quality of life for people. These are all these kind of vicious cycles. But the good news is that if you can reverse some of them, you can really start these virtuous cycles where eating that is better ecologically, is better for our bodies, can be better for small farmers. All of these things are also linked in a positive sense. So it gives me a lot of hope.
And Kurt, talk about sustainability in your new role at Gordon Food Services. You were talking about that before too, as the corporate executive chef. Talk about that.
Yeah, my job within Gordon Food Services is always changing, but very focused on trends and looking at what's going on. But I think it's pretty neat, the company that I work for, that sustainability piece is really important, and the diversity factor is also really important with diverse suppliers, and looking at the carbon emissions and trying to track. That's something that's going to be coming in the near future. You're going to have to be able to produce and look at all of the numbers. Where's the product shipping from, and does it make sense? And just because it's the cheapest doesn't necessarily mean that's the right way to go. And then supporting as much, obviously, that idea of local, but also then supporting as much as we can within certain areas. We've got a lot of relationships across the U.S. with not just maybe a supplier, let's say, from a vegetable or a protein standpoint, but maybe there's a product that like everybody water. So it's that giving back to people that don't have clean water in the world, and then helping that company get going and support that company and that mission. And it's a boxed water. So again, you're looking at, there's no plastics involved and things like that.
And Kurt, we were talking about some of the food trends earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Are there a couple of things you might just recommend if people want to try something different this holiday season?
Well, pimento cheese corn muffins sure seem to be.
We can vouch for those.
Those are really good.
Big thumbs up.
I think you're looking at, you taking the idea of comfort food and maybe giving it a little bit of a twist or a zap. And, something as simple, I like the term spicy. It is a word. And it's something that's been around for a long time, right? We've all had Red Hots when we were kids. So that sweet and spicy element. So you can, I do a grilled, a really hard griddled zucchini. So it gets, super, super caramelized, browned, and then you turn it over, and a little bit of hot honey over it, and my kids can't stop eating it. So it's an easy vegetable to produce. with just a little bit of fun. Again, that world flavor. Dip your toe into it a little bit. Be okay with trying Brussels sprouts and roasting them, and then taking something like maple syrup that's right here in Michigan and maybe putting it with something that's spicy like samba olik that's from over in Southeast Asia. Or if you don't want to go quite that way, you can, if you have sriracha or, use what you have in your fridge too. Don't sit there and feel like you have to go out and buy these 5 or 10 other ingredients because somebody said to. If you happen to have someone that has some local honey, you can add a hot sauce to it. The Google machines that we have in the interweb are good and bad, right? They can get you into a direction and they can at least inform you or get you into hopefully the right place for an idea.
Yeah. Well, I hope we've given listeners a lot to think about when it comes to food. I know I've thought about some new things today, but let me just ask you to leave us with some final thoughts related to our conversation, Helen.
I'm just, I'm excited to get into the holidays myself. It's just such a great time to be with family. It's, a time to, I think, reflect on, the big issues that we've talked about today with food, but also just about, I think more and more it's a hard world out there, and these times where we can sort of, have this haven with our families, that's really important.
Hear, hear. Kurt?
I can't say that enough. Family means the world to me, and so it's always a good time. Sometimes it can be hard, but again, that idea of food brings people together. And maybe to touch on that, I just had this thought about the picky eater thing. And I think one of the things you're seeing is people playing with these different flavors, but giving them to people in a way that it's relatable. So whether it's as a pizza or as a taco or as a sandwich, so it's way more identifiable,
approachable.
Yeah. And it's like it's a taco. It's taco's delicious. How is it not? So you could put grilled octopus in there, and you can sneak that in there maybe, or whatever those oddball ingredients might be. So it's kind of neat to see how that is shifting in things.
And Cheryl, how about you?
Well, this conversation has gotten me really excited about the holidays, and there's so many coming up, not just Thanksgiving.
Right.
And on a final note, I'll just say I wish everyone listening a very happy Thanksgiving if you celebrate, and you can keep in mind that Benjamin Franklin's favorite bird was the turkey.
All right. Well, that was Cheryl Kirschenbaum, host of PBS's Serving Up Science. Chef Kurt Kwiatkowski is the corporate executive chef at Gordon Food Services, and Helen Veit is an associate professor of history here at Michigan State University. Thank you all for talking food with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
I'm Russ White. This is MSU Today.